and doing closed captioning. All right. So good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we have an extraordinary evolutionary biologist with us today, Elisabet Sahtouris. She is an evolutionary biologist, a futurist, and a sustainability consultant to businesses, government agencies, and other organizations. She holds a PhD in evolutionary biology. I can't pronounce the name of that university. Can you tell me how it's pronounced, Elisabet?
You're muted, Elisabet.
Oh, yeah, Elisabet, you need to not be muted. Well, I guess
if you're asking how to.
Okay, I got it.
I was just asking you, Elisabet, how do you pronounce the university that you teach at? I mean, that you got your PhD from.
Oh, Dalhousie.
Dalhousie University in Canada, and is on the faculty of Chaminade University in Honolulu, Hawaii, where she has taught in the School of Business and Communication MBA program. She helped redesign the program for entrepreneurship and local living economies. She has worked in several countries, including the US, Australia, Brazil, Europe, Asia, and Africa. She's been everywhere. She's a citizen of the US and her native Greece. She has appeared in several documentary films and is the author of Earth Dance, Living Systems and Evolution, A Walk Through Time, From Stardust to Us, Biology Revisioned, and Gaia's Dance, The Story of Earth and Us, and others. Elisabet is an unusual mix of evolutionary biologist and engaging storyteller. She is able to weave a compelling narrative about the evolutionary process and the importance of cooperation. So welcome, Elisabet. We're excited to have you with us today.
Aloha mai kako, as we say in Hawaii. It means loving greetings to all of you.
Well, wonderful. Wish we were there with you, I think. I'm going to start out the first question with something we talked about the other day, and it's, I think, one of your great passions is relegating the idea of the survival of the fittest kind of to the dustbin of history and look at the evolutionary cycle where cooperation has been really the key factor in evolution. So would you explain some of that to us and what you have discovered in your research through the years, the role of cooperation?
Yes, very happy to. I guess because I grew up in nature and was free to commune with all kinds of living species and things, it seemed a bit strange to me to talk about it in such mechanical terms as you are taught in universities. And eventually the Darwinian story that I was taught just felt like a two-sided suit, like I was a snake that had shed its skin or something like that. And I started looking into things myself and was very influenced by the work of Jim Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. And what was new then, the Gaia theory, came out around the time when I was doing a postdoctoral at the Museum of Natural History in New York City, but developing as it went on. And I had run off to Greece to write novels because I didn't see science as answering my big questions of who are we, where did we come from, where are we headed? So I went off to Greek islands to write novels to explain the human condition to myself. And then suddenly one day out walking, a stick insect fell on my sleeve as I was walking under the pine trees, and I burst into tears. I hadn't seen one since my childhood. And I realized I still want to do evolution biology. Well, long story short, influenced by Lynn Margulis's microwild world story of how ancient bacteria had duked it out for a long time and then come together to build cooperative, huge communities that became nucleated cells, the kind of cells we're made of. I said, duh, wow, cooperation, that's what sounds right to me. It isn't all about the feisty competitive phase, which began to look to me like a juvenile phase, where it's very creative and you duke it out and you bump each other off and all that. And then you find that that's too energy expensive, and that cooperation takes a lot less energy than competition. So there they were, those ancient bacteria doing it. And then as you go on in evolution, that first big stage leap was from the bacteria to the nucleated cell. The nucleated cells new on the planet did the same thing, duked it out for a long time, and eventually came together in cooperation to form multi-celled creatures. Whereupon you can fast forward to what you learned in school about things developing in the oceans, coming onto land, flowers, dinosaurs, up to us. So now I see humanity doing the same thing, that we are repeating this cycle, and that we are right in that phase where you transition like the caterpillar into a butterfly, from the highly competitive creative stage to the mature cooperative stage. And that is what fires me up as an evolution biology, because I see this as our evolutionary mandate to mature now, to rise up and wise up, as Steve Behrman says. Anyway, that's the story in a nutshell of what. And I should add that we now have mainstream biologists, evolution biologists, such as David Sloan Wilson, coming out and showing exactly why cooperation is so much more important to evolution than the competitive phase. The competitive phase, as I say, it's creative and it builds up to where you can become a really exciting, mature, cooperative community.
It's an interesting idea that you go back to, saying that competitive era is more the adolescent era of an evolving entity, and that the maturing, whatever it is, a cell or an entity, becomes more cooperative. I think that's a very interesting thing to think about. And also you mentioned something about nature's economics, and I might ask you to explain that and talk about that, what that means to you.
Yes, that was, I'm so happy that Dave and Fran are here with us today. I so enjoyed your talk last week, Dave. And we're old friends, and I'm a major supporter of Yes Magazine and all that. What I came to was looking at the words ecology and economy, and realizing that the Greek, they are Greek words, ekologia and ekonomia. And economy is the ecos, the ecos in Greek, which is the household. And the Greeks saw households at all levels, from family to community to country to world to cosmos. And that the same principles apply at all those levels. It's a holarchic view of nature. And so the ecos with nomos together, economy, is the rule. The nomos is the law. The rule or law of the household is economics. And the ecology is ecos plus logos, which is the design of the household. And back in the early 90s, when in the first Clinton administration, I got an invitation to his sustainability. They were dialogues on sustainability, and was privileged to draw a lottery whereby I got a 3-minute opportunity to talk to the whole group. And I said, you've been spending the whole morning talking about whether you need to talk about economics in what's supposed to be about ecology. And I said, why have you taken them apart? That is the problem, that you can't separate the rule of the household from its design. And so this business of ecology and economy became very interesting to me. And what I saw was that our economy has made ecology subservient to it, treating it as a set of resources for human use. And instead, if we turned that upside down and fit our economy into nature by learning nature's living economics, then we would have what has been called an ecosophy, and different people using that term have defined it a little bit differently. It literally means the wise household, ecos with Sophia attached to it, right? So an ecosophy is one in which you understand that nature's economics, I mean, what is an economy? If you start there, it's the acquisition of resources and their transformation to use, and then their distribution and consumption, and in human use, the tossing away of it afterwards, and in nature's use of it, you recycle it, right? So you have a circular economy in nature. So nature's been doing economics, for as long as it's been around. And if we take our guidance from nature, and the ancient Greek definition of science, by the way, was philos sophias, friend of wisdom. And the purpose of natural science was to gain wisdom in human affairs by studying nature, which is why I went into the science in the first place, though I didn't know that until later. So nature is constantly transforming bits of itself into other things that are useful to each other, and species feed each other, and plants and animals feed each other, and all of that stuff is recycled. And so I came to the term living economies. And Dave will remember when I introduced that word at the Social Venture Network in the 90s. I had taken a walk around the lake with Susan Davis and told her about it. And she said, "You've got to talk about that here." And boy, we were off and running, and Dave and I and others wrote papers on it, and there it went. So nature's economy is so worth looking at and learning from, and more people are coming to it. I read so many things these days that say we've got to learn from nature.
That's been a missing piece in a way, because nature has been separated from the academic study of a lot of things, especially economics. It's definitely been separated from it. I think this goes along with it. One of the things you have talked about, and I find very interesting to ask you about how you are seeing this, when you say the difference between transhumanism and real humanism, would you explain what those are?
Yes, well, transhumanism started out as just being this interest in technology and how we can improve on nature through technology, and in particular, how we can improve on ourselves, on our human selves through technology. And of course, some of that has been very useful. Western medicine is good at carpentry and replacing joints and things like that with mechanical devices, and even making artificial hearts and things like that. But transhumanism has now been taken up by the artificial intelligence people, and it's become something that looks to me very dangerous, that this robotics future in which all of our work is done by the robots and humans are altered so that they can, one of transhumanism's ideas, technologically, can we learn to live forever? Hey, I'm an evolution biologist. I'm a recycler. I'm perfectly fine with going out so that other babies can be born. And I remember once being in a dialogue with people in a conference where we were supposed to think 1,000 years ahead to the future. And this one man came up, and he was in his 90s already, I think. And he said, "We're living on the inside of a hollowed out astronaut, what do you call it?
Asteroid?
An asteroid," right? They were all astronauts in asteroids, and hollowed out, and we still play baseball and stuff like that. And I said, "How do new babies get born in your world?" And he said, "Well, once in a while, one of us decides to leave, and then a baby can be born." And I thought, because they had limited space. And I thought of these angels sitting on a cloud saying, nudging each other, saying, "You go, no, you go," because none of them wanted to be born into this geriatric world.
Well, it's interesting what people see 1,000 years ahead. I don't think any of us have any clue what would be happening 1,000 years ahead. We only project what's inside of our own minds. But that's an interesting exercise put it that way.
Yes, it is. And I should say that now what concerns me about the transhumanism idea is that it has been taken up as major behavior modification, as in, I don't know how many of you have read, I know that some of you have read Shoshana Zuboff, the Harvard professor's book, Surveillance Capitalism. And she does a great job of tracing behavior control, technological behavior modification from the 1950s up. And I personally knew Fred Skinner, who started all that stuff, and that has never gone out of the picture, but kind of has been underground. And the behavior modification has been so perfected by now that well, in China, for instance, the kids voluntarily use apps on their phones that track all their behavior and give them merits and demerits for their social behavior, and are literally shaped into behaving the way the society wants them to without being compelled to do it. And it's this insidious new technologies that know all about how to control us through algorithms and how to steal our personal data in order to build the algorithms to control us. That is the transhumanism that I am concerned about. And what I call real humanism is, of course, studying nature, taking guidance from it, and building clean, green economies, not less high tech or more high tech, but without damaging nature, so that every new technology has to prove that it is not doing damage, but making things better. And there are some wonderful new ones on the agenda.
Yes, there are. This brings me to another area that you've expressed a lot of interest in, and that is cities becoming more important than nation states. And would you explain what you mean by that, especially addressing the climate crisis?
Yes, this is very interesting to me. And I got especially interested in cities when the Rockefeller Foundation started this new, they chose 300 cities from around the world to build, new futures and things like that. And I had noticed often in flying that by day and by night, cities look much more like cells on a substrate than anything else I could think of. You can always see that nuclear hub and the transport systems and the kind of amoeba pseudopods reaching out into the countryside. And so I started looking at cities as cells, especially or only the cities that have grown from small villages. And so have always had kind of bloodlines running through them and growing gradually, expanding, developing in a natural way. And there have been wonderful city states, as you know, Georgia, with Dubrovnik, that was, a beautiful city state with no armies. And in modern times, you have now mayors of cities around the world connecting with each other. The Rockefeller kind of project connecting cities with each other. They funded sustainability officers in all those cities for a few years until the city would take it over itself. And we now have, Honolulu, as we say here, was one of those cities and has such an agency in our city government now. So when you look at nations, they are artificial scratched lines across cultures, and they have caused an awful lot of problems by doing that, by scratching them out. They're not based on bioregionalism. They're based on political wars and conquests and things like that. So I see how very unnatural nation states are. And that makes me think that if evolution proceeds and the planet is dominant, as it always has been and should be, then nation states will probably fade away. And with them will go the wars, because they're the ones who create the wars. And the cities are not doing that, or not holding armies, and so they have more resources. So if you think in maturation, you save energy when you move from the competitive warfare model that's very expensive, even very profitable under capitalism, and you move into cooperation. You save all that money and you have all that energy to build a better society in. So that's why I think cities are going to outlive nation states, and that it's a good thing that they will.
And many of them have
Yeah,
in the past.
not counting the instant cities built in the Middle East or China. You cannot build a city and plug people unrelated to each other into them and expect them to work, because the whole point of a living city is the relationships.
Right. It's organic. So I think Dubrovnik was a very interesting model because it was a city-state for 600 years with no army, no war, and yet they were surrounded by cities that were, or states that were going to war. It's a very interesting model for another discussion. But I wanted to get to something else that you've talked about, and that is a global consortium of sciences and what that would mean. Identifying worldviews or how they are perceived on a more global, with a global perspective. I'm just the global consortium of sciences that
Yes.
you talked about. What that is.
Yeah. Well, my interest in science extended to the foundations of science. And I was married to a mathematician who taught me about the foundations of mathematics. And then I realized that science too, well, also in graduate school, when I was a graduate student in the 1950s, we actually had philosophy of science courses. And we were asked to design a science by laying out the fundamental axioms for that science. So I was very interested in those fundamental axioms. What were they? What they are really is the worldview of whoever invents the science. So in the case of Western science, these European scientists who were enamored of machinery, of robotics, on church towers, the early robots that clanked and beat drums and blew trumpets and stuff like that. And so they saw the world in terms of such mechanics, and they made models of it that way. And they had fundamental axioms that literally stated that the universe is a non-living matter, and later energy was brought into that worldview situation, and that that you could be completely objective about the universe as though you were not part of it, was another axiom. So, and then came in entropy, the idea that everything is running down, that it starts with one big bang and then a linear progression in which it fades away to heat death or no thingness. And I thought, gee, this is a pretty bleak worldview, that we've built the dominant science in the world on. So, but at that time, I was also, close to Willis Harman and people like that. And we were talking about the new science we were building and this paradigm shift. And Kuhn's classic book on paradigm shifts, was very much read at that time. And Willis was asking questions like, are we building a separate science, or are we embedding this new science in the old one, or which way does it go? And so I looked at this and decided later, after the year 2000, in the first decade of the century, to hold a symposium in which we invited all PhDs in science and philosophy of science from different parts of the world to come together, and they would all be the ones who were trained in the dominant worldview of Western science and had made the shift to what we were calling the new paradigm. And I wanted to document that shift and write out what were the axioms we had been taught and what were the axioms we now held in the new science. And in the middle of that symposium, I had an epiphany. And I said, oh my God, we're talking conquest model here. We're going to replace the old science with a new one, right? And I said, no, we can't do that. Let's see this as two separate sciences, because the science is defined by its axioms. So of course, the quantum physicists had discovered Vedic science, and all of the founding fathers of quantum science actually publicly wrote about how they had to look to Vedic science for their axioms in order to understand their own results, even though they were working within the field of Western science. So let's call this one Vedic science and this one Western science. And long story short, we did another symposium in Kuala Lumpur for Islamic science. And Islamic science, it turned out, had a living universe as its basic feature. Number one axiom was Allah creates the universe. The number two axiom was Allah created a living universe and told us to study it. So I said to them, you know, why don't you teach Islamic science side by side in your universities along with Western science, distinguish between them and have them dialogue with each other? And if you can do something they haven't done, then that will get you noticed, because they're not going to say you're a real science, but you have to prove it on your own. So I said, do a science of economics. They don't have one. And I knew that by then that nature is, you know, a great teacher of economics, as Dave knows too.
That I find very interesting, that connection. But I also
So
want to go back to
there we were with three sciences, and then that birthed the idea, why not a global consortium of sciences the way the religions do the global parliaments of global religions? And then you'd have checks and balances so that the living universe people can say to the mechanical universe people, you're not allowed to make technology that harms nature, right? And so that they could talk with respect to each other the way the religions do. It seems so obvious that that should be a stage, at least, of in our multicultural world, where we want to honor other cultures, and perhaps we will come up with a global science and a global spirituality out of that. But I think we need to go through that stage.
So that consortium has not come together yet.
No.
We're not waiting for it. Maybe we'll be part of it. I wanted to go back to one thing you said. This will be the last question I'll ask you before we open it up to the audience, about entropy, because that's so long, it has been the way we've been taught, that there is the Big Bang and then it's downhill from there, really, once it expands out. I've always thought of the universe as in cycles, where it goes out, it comes back, it goes out and comes back. But I don't understand why entropy is still thought of as the way things move. And isn't that counter to a cooperative model?
Yeah, well, entropy is a historical thing in Western science, because the the steam engine was invented around the time of Darwin, and and the entropy was, the idea was thought up in a closed system rather than an open system, and it just stuck. And the Big Bang theory, solidified it, and was said to prove it. But of course, it still is a theory. Darwinian evolution is a theory, And the point is, you cannot make a theory in a vacuum. You have to make a theory within a science that has a story already, right? You have to have your axioms and your worldview before you can ask, how does it work? You have to have that conceptual universe before you can ask questions of it. And so entropy is one of the things that we're stuck with. And I like to talk about my keyboard metaphor for the universe,
Great.
In which, if you think of an endless keyboard, and some of you, I don't know if you've passed it on yet, Georgia, but she has a copy that she can pass on.
I will to everybody on the call.
An endless keyboard of vibrations, because pretty much all scientists will agree that the universe somehow is made of vibrations, right? And that's something fundamental about vibration. And so keyboards can represent a series of vibrations. And if you put matter in the low keys and then energy in the mid-range, when science brought it in, because Western science starts at the low end of the keyboard with the matter end of the keyboard. And it has come, once it could measure energy, that came into its official picture. And it has gotten up as far as 0-point energy, and then it gets stuck. If you keep going up the keyboard, you go matter, energy, spirit, consciousness, mind, things of that kind, which Western devices can't measure. So they get stuck trying to derive the whole universe and assume that it doesn't exist. The other sciences of the world, all of the Eastern sciences, most of the indigenous science, start at the other end of the keyboard with the highest vibrations, with consciousness or with spirit, and then slow the vibrations down to the world of matter and see the whole thing. If you look, for example, at Taoist science, it's matter, energy, spirit, consciousness. So it's not a new sequence that I thought up, but the keyboard metaphor is nice because then you can say to the people who are trying to integrate science and spirituality, why did you take them apart? You know, there's no reason. You don't have to integrate them. You just have to recognize that you are not a body with a mind, with a soul. You're a body, mind, soul, right?
Yes. Well, I just actually uploaded the keyboard metaphor to the chat log so everyone can get it through there. I'll also send it to everyone who's registered on this call. I'll send that keyboard metaphor to them. And I'll also send the piece that you did on Susanna Zuboff on the surveillance capitalism. Is that okay to send that too?
Yes, of course. And if anybody's interested in my Cities and Cells article, you can find it on Hazel Henderson's Ethical Markets website. Just go to Ethical Markets and put my last name in and it'll come up there.
It'll pop up.
It's probably also on my website. I think so.
I'm sure it should be.
There's one more thing, Georgia, I'd like to introduce before we go to dialogue, or is that where you were going to go next?
Ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, and that's my interest in democracy. And because, nature is profoundly conservative with things that work well and radically creative with things that don't work, right? She goes in fits and starts and she can move fast. And what we've done in what we call our democracy is to separate those two things of conservatism and progressivism as though they were antagonistic rather than a friendly division of labor. So how do you get those together? Well, if you look at where our democracy, quote unquote, started, the founding fathers were on land that had already been occupied by the Haudenosaunee League of Nations, which was operating under a great law of peace. And Benjamin Franklin, one of the authors of the Constitution, got to know the Indians very well. And he ran to his fellows and said, you've got to copy their great law of peace. They've got this fantastic constitution themselves. Well, again, long story short, the only thing he got them to adopt was the tripartite division of government for checks and balances. But they left out women, children, nature, and the future. A few minor details. The fact is that the Haudenosaunee had the only working democracy, real democracy I know of. And it's one of the reasons why I became passionate about Indigenous knowledge, science, wisdom as a co-founder of the Worldwide Indigenous Science Network. And so I think we have an awful lot to learn there. The Greeks' democracy was incomplete. So are all the other ones that have been tried, including our own. But we do have an example of one that really did work.
Can you write the name of that in the chat box, Elisabet?
Yeah, I can do that while you do a few words of transition.
Yeah, I'll do some transitioning while you put that in the chat box. You see where it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I'm going to look now for people to raise their hands. When I call on you, you can unmute yourself, but otherwise I think it's best to stay muted. So who would like to ask a question, make a comment? Okay, I see John.
Did it?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with just you mentioned science being a construct of those searching for it. Would you say mathematics is invented or discovered? Like, is mathematics real or grounded in objectivity, or is there any hope there? Or?
Just a minute. I put it in the wrong.
No, you didn't. We have it.
You do have it. Okay.
We have
it. Sorry.
John,
is mathematics real or invented? Is that the question?
Yeah, discovered or invented, I think is the common.
Or discovered or invented. Well, mathematics also rests on axioms. So in that sense, you know, only in the last century was it recognized that mathematics and logic are both invented languages invented by humans. It's interesting because we have to distinguish between natural languages and artificial or invented languages. Um, so logic and math both have a set of axioms, a set of components, and a set of rules for combining those components. In that sense, it's a pure human invention. In another sense, you can look at what's called sacred geometry, for instance, and you can abstract from nature these beautiful mathematics. You can get them from nature, like the golden mean spiral, for instance. So it's a combination of things that you actually can find by abstracting them from nature. By the way, the concept of abstraction became interesting to me because I studied art before science because my parents said science was for boys and sent me off to study art. And I never could do abstract art. I was really good at doing figurative. I could sculpt the human body. I could draw realistically, but I had no idea what this abstract art, and things always fell apart on me when I tried to do that. When I became a scientist, I learned what abstraction meant. It meant model building. Okay. Science rests entirely on building these models of what you see in nature so that we can understand them. Right? And abstraction is exactly that. You lift out of nature those elements which you can combine into a model. So just as Picasso did his Guernica painting by abstracting elements that he saw in warfare and putting them together in his own way, so does a scientist measure things about, let's say, a heart. How do you get to a heart as a pump? You measure whatever you can about the physiology and you put those components together and you make a model as a pump, and it actually does some of what a heart does. But of course, you can't take the heart and put it on a table and have it work the way a pump would. It has to be in context. Nature always has everything in context. So that's a long-winded answer to a short question you had, but I hope I satisfied you on saying it is both.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm looking to see, do we have some other questions, comments from anybody?
I
While we're waiting, I'm going to bring up something that I thought we didn't get a chance to go into. Oh, I see one from Jerry, so I'll go to that. Jerry, do you want to unmute
Yeah,
yourself?
I really enjoyed your talk. When you were talking about the different qualities of energy, of going from matter to energy to spirit, what it brought up for me was my psychedelic experience. So number one, I'm just curious, have you ever done that?
Your what? Psychedelics?
Yeah, because my experience was that I did graduate work in philosophy at one point. Um, and I got very interested with phenomenology and in the relationship between perception and reality and whatnot. And a lot of those questions seemed to me to be answered when I took psychedelics, because I was able to experience firsthand qualities of energy that we don't have any vocabulary for or metrics, as you were saying. So I'm wondering if you've ever done that.
Yeah, the best one I did was LSD, and I only did it once, and it was phenomenal. I was like whisked around in past lives and had really amazing experiences. You know, one minute I'd be standing in a bread line in the snow with burlap wrapped feet. Uh, and in Russia somewhere, I think, on the steps. And then I'd be on the palace at Versailles balcony looking down into the garden, and, you know, various things like that came up. I tried ayahuasca once. I had vowed to do it only when I was actually had a true medicine priest doing it with me in the actual jungle in South America. And while I was living in Peru, I did do that once. But I messed it up myself by, I don't know why, stupid thing. I stopped myself from barfing as I should have. So I got a lot of jiggly geometry and unpleasant feelings.
Ayahuasca is a very challenging drug.
Doesn't
DMT.
sound like any fun. I don't like non-fun things.
Well,
Right. The LSD was much more fun. It
Yeah.
took a little bit of a tiny thing on my tongue.
I was just curious. Thanks.
Anyone else? Oh, go ahead. Did you want to say something, Elizabeth?
No, I thought Jerry had said something else.
No,
No,
I'm done. Thanks.
he thanked you.
Okay.
Yeah, I was interested in the relationship between the material and the spiritual, and how you saw that progression of understanding the Vedic model of describing quantum physics, that the scientists had to actually look at the Vedic scriptures to understand what they were seeing and how to describe what they were talking about or finding. That seems a way of bringing the East and the West together in a kind of a profound understanding. And I don't know how many Western scientists are open to it, into understanding the Vedic way of describing reality.
Yeah, I think that's why the keyboard model is really helpful, because you can show it to Western scientists. You can remind them that they have only taken reality as measurable things, and that measurable things mean that you have to have a measuring instrument, and that measuring instrument has to be made of matter. So, try to work with people on things that they agree to, right? And then suggest that, aren't we just extending the keyboard as far as we can all the time? And do we rewrite the axioms of Western science, or do we allow for this to be a different science? It's up to people. I'm not into telling other people what to do, but it's fun to try to lure them into more unified ways of seeing things. Plus, I love the concept of reincarnation. Even if I only take it as a working hypothesis, it's bound to make me, to begin with, less prejudiced, right? Because I have to accept then that I may have been any of those things I'm complaining about in other people. And I do believe that I had lifetimes in which I caused a lot of murder and mayhem, right? And lots of other ones in which I did almost nothing, and it was a pretty blah life, right? I wasn't always Cleopatra, right? So I love the idea that you don't have to do everything in one lifetime. I love the idea that you can, that I see incarnation, by the way, because I believe in the eternal now. It is always now. We have never been outside of now. Two of the things that bother me about Western science are the refusal to acknowledge that it's always now, that we cannot be in the past or the future unless we're doing it now. And the other thing is to not recognize that everything you know about the universe is coming through your consciousness. So you don't have any picture outside of your consciousness of anything. Including the whole universe. So these are fun things, and I can't guarantee what will happen when I die, but I like to think that I will have choices, and that that dreaming is a very good practice for the afterlife. I'm a great fan of Jane Roberts' Seth books. Raise your hands if those of you who know about the Seth books.
Yeah,
Okay.
I've read them.
Okay. Well, I recently did a dream seminar with some wonderful Sethi teachers. And I had an epiphany in the middle of that dream class, which was about going into not only the dreams you have now, but lucid dreaming, intentional dreams, and seeing the dream world and the waking world in parallel to each other, and learning how to go back and forth between them. Well, I had the epiphany that I had during the class was that on a number of times in my life, I've had a spirit voice appear in my head telling me to do something that was so compelling that I did it against all odds. For instance, the last time I did it, I was at Findhorn. I got the words "go to Hawaii" in my head. And I knew it was one of those calls. I had so little money, I couldn't even pay my rent on Mallorca, where I was living at the time. But I had to follow the voice, because I'd done it before and it always worked. And sure enough, magically, everything happened in time, on time, in the most amazing sequence of things, like getting called to London, getting 2 gigs there, the pay for which added up to the total bill for shipping my stuff to Hawaii. I didn't even have to change from pounds to dollars because I was using a British shipping company, right? And so that way, my stuff and I arrived on the same day without the shipping company knowing which day I was going to get there, because I had stopped all kinds of places across the US. Here's the epiphany that happens in the dream class. I suddenly got that spirit voice of mine, that higher power, that remote, wonderful, magical thing that had shaped my life in interesting ways, was my own higher self. It was my soul entity. In the now, my incarnations to me are like, like the petals of a lotus. I used to do a meditation in a closet with a candle and mirror, in which I called other incarnations in to sit with me. It was a drumming meditation that I made up because I knew it's always now. So I could talk to them saying, am I doing my part? What's our overall mission, right? And some interesting characters showed up. So all of this is very interesting to me. And
probably to our people too. I know Fran Corton wants to ask something. Do you want to unmute? Yeah. Fran?
Actually, yeah. David.
Yeah.
Well, it's David. Okay.
Yeah, Elisabet, it's just so amazing to reconnect. And I first want to comment on an insight that you brought to me today, and then I've got a question that follows. I often note that what we refer to as culture, institutions, including money, basically have no existence outside of the human mind. They're purely human creations. What I never realized quite until what you outlined today is, well, I was beginning to realize that language is also just in our heads, but I never realized that mathematics is only in our heads, that we think this is the real ultimate foundation of science, and yet it's totally a fabrication of the mind. That really blows my mind. Anyhow, what I want to ask you about is your insight into what has so long for me seemed a fundamental contradiction of science. And it comes back to the issue of entropy, that everything's winding down. And yet, just the science story of creation starts out with this diffuse cloud of energy, and everything about it is winding up into greater complexity and differentiation and all of that, which would seem to be science saying the reality is the reality of negative entropy. What's your insight into how science itself reconciles that such an obvious contradiction?
Well, negentropy, of course, is what Western science calls life. And so it says my fundamental model is that everything is running down. Life goes against that tide, building itself up. But eventually it's going to get swept away too. That's the Western science story.
But it's not just life. I mean, it's the whole material universe is winding up as well.
Well, I got my first real insight into the entropy question from Teddy Goldsmith. I don't know how many of you know, he's the brother of Jimmy Goldsmith, who was once upon a time the richest man in the world. And Teddy had organized 3 Gaia conferences in Cornwall, England. He had founded a magazine, and I think it's called Resurgence now. What was
The
it?
Ecologist.
The Ecologist magazine, right?
I know
And
that.
in an early issue of the Ecologist, I think he published an article saying, what is this entropy when the Earth has been building up its nature more and more complexity for about as a third of the whole life of the universe, surely by now. And Teddy and I agreed that the only entropy we could find on the Earth was due to humans. that we were somehow a strangely entropic creation species. And we've been doing it since before we invented the concept of entropy, since we could make axes and chop trees, I guess. And as you know, I have a slide in some of my shows showing us on the moon looking at Earth and seeing the only sign of human life over time as the expansion of deserts, that we're a desert making species. It's an entropic kind of behavior that we engage in. But I mean, Teddy just made so much sense. Surely we should have seen this entropy at work, you know, in a third of the life of the universe time frame for our own planet. And so it just doesn't exist in other sciences. It is a fabrication. I do want to say about math that yes, it's a purely human invention, but it's a useful one in abstracting models from nature. Otherwise, we wouldn't be playing it if it were only a head game. We play mathematics because we can play it out in relationships that we look for in nature and understand in our terms. Although, you know, there were lots of cultures like the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee, by the way, are the ones we know as the Iroquois. I should have said that before. They didn't have a concept of entropy, you know, and their language was adequate to describe nature. The average Amazon native kid can distinguish 300 species of bees alone. You know, their sciences are very sophisticated without such concepts. So it's one I think really needs to go because life rules and the universe. Plus, you know, if the great eternal now is always now, what's to fall apart?
Yeah, it's always interested me, the whole idea of entropy and how it just seems such a contradiction to what we experience in real life.
Recycling, of
Except
course.
what humans do.
Yeah.
You know, the climate crisis is a perfect example of that. So I'm going to go to Lori Gallion next. You want to unmute?
Well, funny you should say that, Georgia, because my question is really on the climate crisis. As we have studied, you know, and certainly had it as a focus in several of the series, you know, here at Praxis Peace. I just love the connection and the direction with which Elisabet speaks as a possible fundamental principle, at least to build the conversations that, you know, and the uncomfortable conversations about what climate crisis means to each one of us, you know, certainly within the next 5 or 10 years. And, but I also, that's my question. The one comment I wanted to make was just that I was just reading and listening to a podcast on how emotions today, and especially during the pandemic, have not allowed a lot of people to listen to that inner voice, and how important it is to recognize that this actually drives us and that we need to be searching for that voice. So thank you, Elisabet, for bringing that forward and the confidence that that voice actually has for you. Okay, so now my question about the climate crisis.
Do you remember it, Elisabet? I don't.
Okay.
I was waiting for her to state it again.
I think you have to state it again, Lori.
Well, just I'm thinking, because our conversations have been about climate crisis, how do we incorporate some of what Elisabet is saying as a fundamental principle for relativity at least, and for speaking and building upon, you know, in a 5 and a 10-year window for us personally.
I'm still not clear on what about what I've been speaking about. You mean the inner voice?
No, what I'm saying is that when we are speaking about climate crisis, given the representation that you're trying to show as, you know, the natural, biological and economic basis, okay, in which we will be solving problems or expanding people's minds to solve the problem. Can you kind of give us a clue or a lane in which to stay?
Well, there are several things that I think are important, and that you know, I remember back in the 80s talking with Jim Lovelock, and he was saying, pray for an ice age, Elisabet, because if we don't get the ice age we're due for now, we're in danger of tipping the Earth in the opposite direction into a hot age, and a hot age will be harder to survive than an ice age. The point is that a hot age and the Earth has done snowball Earths, and it has done ice-free Earths. It's both of those are in the planetary repertoire. Because an ice age is only about 7 or 8 degrees cooler than what we consider normal in this interglacial age, we have survived that. We've survived about a dozen ice ages as humans because we had less infrastructure and we could trek up and down along with the edges of the ice and things like that. But we humans have not experienced a hot age, but knowing that it's that many degrees warmer than what we're used to, hotter than what we're used to, we probably, or we can expect that there will be ways for us to survive it, that it's not a strictly doomsday scenario if we don't stop it. I don't think we can stop it, but I do believe we can do a lot of adaptation. And that if we keep learning from nature, if we go back to natural food, I mean, here we have companies now like Bayer, which on the one hand is profiting hugely from toxifying the whole food supply. I would guess that you all agree that such companies do such things. And then when they've wrecked your immune system through a poor food supply, they sell you pharmaceuticals that are supposed to cure you from this. And right now, the warfare that we committed on the bacterial world when we discovered antibiotics, which means anti-life drugs, for 30 years, we treated all bacteria as germs that had to be eliminated until we finally figured out that we can't live without our gut bacteria and our skin bacteria, that all multi-celled creatures have their contingent of microbes, of bacteria and viruses as their communication system that we're absolutely dependent on. So the more we move away from our natural relationships with the natural world, the more we put ourselves into danger. And I believe that the sanitation aspects of the pandemic now are a real problem, because we're wiping out all of the bacteria and all of the viruses we can, which just what happened with the bacteria, where the hardiest, worst ones survive, making hospitals now the most dangerous places for infections. We're going to do the same with the viruses. And somehow we have to come back into balance and deal with these things and look more toward building our immune systems, doing all of those things that the climate change is demanding that we get back to nature. And the most wonderful things about the pandemic, we're seeing how quickly nature can come back when its human problem kids are locked up, right? And then the second thing I loved was elevating caregivers to heroic status. Instead of politicians and warriors, you know, we now had caregivers being treated as heroes, which is wonderful. So we can always learn, and maybe we have a soul agreement that we had to lock ourselves up this way, a soul agreement. so that we could regroup and reset and rethink how we live on the planet. And so the climate change is like the nudge. It's nature's nudge. Now, okay, darlings, you wanted to make deserts and to have a hotter earth. Here it is now. Get with it. Stay with me, right? See how you can build a world that works. I have friends who have invented hydrogen dirigibles that are clean and green and can fly carrying weights that freighters carry over oceans at almost jet speed. Look up the H2 Clipper. It's been tested for over a year by Dassault, the big aerospace company in France, and they're blown away by it. And it was invented by Ronaldo Brudico, my dear brother in Santa Barbara, who's head of the World Business Academy. Here in Hawaii, I had the privilege of working with a couple of native elders on designing new courses for what we call island economies. And any local economy can think of itself as an island. And so we've looked deeply into climate change. In my last MBA course, I had the students design a sea level rise board level game for the city of Honolulu. How do we face the sea level rise? What do we do about climate change? How do we get with it and stop importing 90% of our food when we can grow anything here? And when there was as big a population here when Captain Cook found us, than as there is today. So we could feed our whole population easily on our own land, even with sea level rise. So there's many ways to look at the climate change and what we can learn from nature and how we can, I like to say to people, you and your loved ones can all survive now and in your generations to come if you do things right now.
Right. Well, that's why we have this Planetary Pause series. All these programs are looking at how we can emerge better than where we were before COVID hit, because it has given us a timeout, a pause to kind of reassess how we want to go forward and how we can save ourselves and the planet, hopefully. So I see a couple of questions. Lori Marshall, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello, Elizabeth. I am the one who made the mural using your beautiful concept of that we are the caterpillar phase destroying our environment and we're now in the imaginal cells. And when we, when I painted this with homeless youth and we made the butterfly that we're turning into, the teenagers made images of all kinds of animals around the butterfly wings and the human being as the central axis of the butterfly. And I wanted to hear your vision of our best hope of the reorganization that that can happen out of COVID and the climate chaos. Just, I want to hear your vision of what's possible and what's happening.
Well, there are so many people now with beautiful visions that, you know, in my vision, if I could do it any way I wanted, I think the first thing I would try to transition out of is private land ownership, even public land ownership, any land ownership. And George Monbiot, M-O-N-B-I-O-T, just gave the annual Schumacher lecture on this subject. And that's it's available online and you can find it easily under Monbiot. I also copied out the whole talk so that I can send it to people if they want just the talk. But he actually has practical suggestions for how to rebuild the old commons. And it was the enclosure of the commons, of course, that got us into trouble. And just starting out by pointing out to people that private land ownership means that some people can have parts of nature that other people cannot have. That when you enclose privately, you deprive publicly. And that we should have a future with sufficient for need and how did he put it? You know, get rid of the greed part. And but I think that the land issue is so important. And he talks about community holdings and how you can create local cooperatives that acquire land only as commons. And in England, anyone, I didn't know this, anyone in England who wants to grow veggies can get a plot on an allotment somewhere. These are public lands where you can ask for your plot of land, you know, grow your own veggies, and you can do whatever you want on your little allotment plot. So anyway, the article has lots of practical ways in which you actually could transition out of private land ownership. And
Very
just the
interesting.
respect for the earth that means. And I love the half earth set aside for nature to regenerate idea. You know, I'm really with that, building corridors from park to park, whatever it takes. I think these are wonderful ideas because we have to live with nature, in nature, clean and green, you know, loving each other, recognizing our oneness, playing the whole keyboard. You all know, we know what to do, but sometimes someone like Monbiot can get you from saying, I want to do away with private land, and actually show you how it could be done. Right. So many kudos to him for that. It's my favorite article right now.
He's an extraordinary person too. Wonderful writing and ideas.
I've been at events with him. We've been at Schumacher together.
Yeah, Schumacher has some wonderful programs as well. I think we're going to take a last question with John.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you mentioned a lot about what we can do to change our cultural and ideas of nature and how to, you know, function. But, you know, if 100, you know, if the top 100 companies produce more than 70% of climate emissions, how much is it our failure to legislate or effectively, or to design more rigid systems? I mean, you know, how much do we have to operate inside the system that we're trapped in to sort of beat the system? And also a second question to that, maybe a postscript, is, are you familiar with quadratic voting or quadratic funding, those ideas? Because those seem to me to offer a lot of promise in the public goods space, because it matters not how much funding you necessarily get, but how many people vote for it. That matters a lot more than the actual money you get. And then there's a pool that rewards how whatever measure had the most people vote for it. So I just, you know, your thoughts on operating inside the system to stop, you know, it doesn't matter how much less meat we eat if the top 100 companies are still pouring out carbon emissions and cruise ships. So
Yes, you know, Hawaii is a perfect microcosm of the macrocosm, in the sense that we import way too much energy and food, and our politics are a real problem. That we have developers still building huge condos on fragile seacoast, and despite what people want. For instance, we've had a very strong move against Monsanto. Beautiful film called Poisoning Paradise, about what they've done to Hawaii. And yet they fund our state university, which is the biggest university, University of Hawaii, and we can't get rid of them. And the people, even though they get legislation passed, their top politicians will then veto it. So our legislative process is a big problem. I'm allowed to testify against 5G here only if I don't cite any health consequences from it. I mean, the way that our legislative system cripples you is bizarre. And it means that we have not elected the right people, that we have not elected people who speak for the people. And it's because we, the people, abdicate too much responsibility. Voting seems to be an imposition in the US. In Greece, voting is your natural right, and everybody does it. And if you don't do it, you're not going to get a passport or a driver's license, even if you vote against all the candidate. You can put in a plague on all your houses vote, but you have to show up at the polls, okay? So democracy demands that all the people have to be involved. And the best way we can do it, I think, John, is through local community participation. We have to work at our local level, getting our local people. If they all practice politics actively, then you can grow that among the different local places. But our politics are a bad mess now, and the number of laws it takes to do anything. I mean, the US could do a clean green economy. We know now that you can make money up by the trillions. So that's not a problem. You can got loads of unemployed people to build all the infrastructure. Loved listening to Pete Buttigieg last night about transportation system, why we need way more public transportation, way less private transportation beyond bicycles. In Germany, my cousins, can rent a car anytime they want. It's delivered to their door, but they don't have to own one and have a garage for it. The sharing, there's so many solutions, but people must be involved. To have a democracy, everyone has to get out there and act like a citizen and, play the game. So yes, the biggest companies are the biggest polluters. Big companies will have a choice. They'll either transition into being something more benign or they'll die. That's how evolution works. You keep up, you adapt, or you go out.
Hopefully a lot of those will go out, like Monsanto.
The faster the better.
Faster the better, yes. This has been really interesting because it's covered a wide range of ideas and science as well as spirituality. And it's been a rich conversation, I think, from our participants as well as your presentation. So any last words you want to say before we stop the recording, Elisabet?
I guess just I love the idea of there are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the earth, as Rumi said, and also the why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open?
A brilliant one to end on, Elisabet. Thank you so much today. This has been wonderful, wonderful having you.
My pleasure. This has been I just love this group of people you put together, Georgia. And
thank you. I love this group too, and you as well.
You should